little bit about what she's been doing since she graduated in 2018.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. Dr. Weston was one of the best stats professors I've ever had, and learned so much from her. And so it was a really great program. Hi, folks. My name is Katie. Like Dr. Weston said, I have a PhD in psychology from UTSA, and I am currently a user experience researcher at Google, which is sometimes abbreviated UXR. And I've been at Google for about 3 years now, and then also an internship there. I was previously on Chrome OS or Chromebook. So if you used a Chromebook when you were in high school, that was the team that I worked on. I helped improve it. I worked on the accessibility features, and I worked on the system user interface, which just means everything that you click on that's part of your laptop was things that I worked on. So if you liked your Chromebook, that was my team. If you didn't like your Chromebook, I'm sorry. I was actually only on the team for like 2 years, so don't blame me. So I want to tell you a little bit about what is user research, just in case you haven't heard of it before. And it's basically talking to users of products, designs. If you use technology or you go shopping or you go to the grocery store, a user researcher has probably tried to figure out how to make that experience best for you as a user. So for example, we have this ketchup bottle. There's 2 different designs of what ketchup bottles are, but the actual user experience of using those different designs of a ketchup bottle are different. And so a user experience researcher would bring people in and they would say, hey, use this ketchup bottle. And they would figure out which one is easiest to use, which one like works the best, which one do people like more. And then they'd give recommendations to designers and engineers and program managers to say, hey, here's the direction that we should go in order to make the best experience for our users possible. So the other photo that I really like is without field research, it's difficult to get an accurate picture of user workflows. You set up 3 little cat bowls with food because you assume they'll line up in perfect order, but the actual user experience of what the cats do is totally different than what you imagined. But you don't know that until you bring people in, you have them use a product, and you get feedback on that product. So I use all sorts of different research methods, some that I learned during my PhD program and some that I had to learn on the job. I do interviews, usability testing. I go out into the field and I observe people in their home as they use technology. I use surveys. I look at back-end data. So whenever you used a Chromebook, it would collect data about where did you click? How long did you stay there? And so I would analyze that data. So lots of really cool projects. And I'm currently on a team called the Central Accessibility Team at Google, which means that I work horizontally with all products at Google. So if you can think of a Google product, Maps, Gmail, Drive, you name it, I work with them in order to make sure that their products work for everyone, including people with disabilities. So it's a pretty fun job, and I've gotten pretty used to talking about what my path looks like. And so I think it's very true that hindsight is 20/20. I've gotten really good at saying, well, yeah, I went here. So then the natural next step was here. So then I got my PhD, and then look at me now, I have a cool job. And it seems really linear, especially if you're really not sure kind of what you want to do in your career. When you listen to other people talk about how they got to where they are, it seems like, oh yeah, she totally knew exactly how to do this. Even Dr. Weston, I think, painted a really lovely picture of me being so confident and sure that this is what I wanted. And so I just went out and got it. But in reality, my career path looked a little bit more like this. There were lots of ups and downs and windy roads and some time off in between programs before I really figured out what did I want and how could I get it. So I'm really excited to kind of show you what this actually looks like. So here's kind of the overview of my journey. I went to a school called Butler University, which is in Indianapolis. The only reason anyone's ever heard of us is because our basketball team was really, really good the years that I was there. I got my bachelor's in psych and math because I really loved understanding human behavior. I remember when I was in junior high and I would sit at the lunch table and I would try to figure out what made my friends happy, what made them annoyed. I would kind of like experiment on them. And I remember a teacher came up to me and was like, you're going to be a psych major. You love figuring out what makes people tick. And I was like, 1, that makes me kind of sound like a jerk. But 2, yeah, I guess that is explaining what I'm doing right now. I'm trying to understand what's their behavior? How do you change their behavior? How do you understand it in the context of the environment? And so it's something I've always been really interested in, which is kind of the thread of my whole career has been research. I've been really passionate, really interested in understanding human behavior and researching it. And so that's kind of the only thread I think that ties through all of these things. But my path is much more windy than I think sometimes I talk about it. So when I graduated with my bachelor's, I said, okay, I know that I want a graduate degree because my mom had been telling me since I was a small child that I want a graduate degree. So I said, yes, I want a graduate degree. And I thought at the time the only way to do applied research was in clinical psychology. So I applied to a bunch of clinical psych programs. I thought, hey, I really love working with older adults. And so I applied to one where I could work with folks with dementia and their family caregivers in order to do behavioral problem solving to try to keep them in the home longer, which was a lot of fun. It was so much fun. There would be all sorts of different behavioral interventions that were needed and trying to figure out, how do we go with the flow? How do we help this person feel better? How do we help, correct behaviors that aren't serving them well? And it was really a good experience. But with that came clinical work, since I was in a clinical program. And I learned that I actually really was not well suited for clinical work. I was a very bad therapist. I dreaded the thought of going to therapy as the therapist, which was like, that doesn't feel healthy for the client-therapist relationship, for me to not be excited to be in therapy. And part of being in a PhD clinical psych program is that you have to do a full year at the end of an internship where you do nothing but therapy all day, every day. And I said, this isn't a good fit for me. And I'm not happy. I'm not enjoying this. I don't want to do therapy. I came here for the applied research, and I'm really not getting that balance of research versus clinical work that I was hoping for. And so I actually dropped out, which was a really hard, big decision for me. I spent 3 years in the program. I decided to get my master's and leave the program. It was a really tough choice, right? My parents were like, what is she doing with her life? This is not going to go well. Why would she quit something? And then like my own personality, which I think a lot of graduate students can kind of agree with, is that we tend to be really goal-driven people, right? And so when you start something, you want to finish it. And so it can be really hard to figure out that the path that you're on is not the good path for you. And so I dropped out of that program. I applied to some jobs and I got some offers at like random stats companies. I think one was like working for the Texas lottery to figure out like what's the mathematics behind different like events that they were running with their lotto cards, right? And nothing really felt like it connected back to that behavior that I was really interested in. So I ended up taking a full gap year after my master's. I hiked the PCT. I got a job at a dog shelter for a few months it was like me as a master's graduate and like a bunch of high school students. We had a really good time though. And I eventually found UTSA's psych PhD program. And I thought, wow, this seems like a really good fit with me. It's in line with what my original goal was. I'd get to spend 100% of my time doing research. I'd get really cool stats classes. I'd get to sign up for like big data classes through the computer science lab. So it was a much better fit for me. So I got my PhD, and then I realized that I was about to graduate and that I needed to make a decision between industry or academics, and they both had lots of pros and lots of cons. I really loved the intellectual freedom that came with staying in academics and getting to research what I wanted. I loved getting to talk with other people in my field on a regular basis. I loved teaching. It was a lot of fun to get to stand up and hang out with undergrads and learn with them. But I didn't necessarily like the pieces of doing research and then sitting alone at my desk and writing papers and kind of cranking them into the publication cycle. And then 9 months later, I'd get feedback saying, hey, can you revise and resubmit? And I'd say, hey, what is this topic even about? I don't know what this project is anymore because it's been so long. And so it really felt like I was just kind of adding to the like academic literature without really having the impact or the speed that I really wanted out of research. And so I ultimately decided to go the route of industry that I think was a really good fit for me. because of what I wanted. I wanted that fast pace. I wanted to interact with users much more. I wanted to be able to give people recommendations based on my research and actually see them come to fruition within a product, which is really cool. I can open up a Chromebook and point to lots of different areas where I said, this is the direction that you should go in. I can point to all sorts of different products across Google now, like Android, and say, hey, I told them that they should change these accessibility settings to do this or say this, and that's my work. And I think that's really impactful. So I got an internship at Google on the central accessibility team that I work on now in order to help them define some stats and some metrics in order to better assess the accessibility experience. And that internship was a really great experience for me because it filled in some of the gaps that I didn't get from graduate school. I think there's lots of ways to make the jump from academics to industry, but for me, internship was a really good fit. I learned a lot of those skills that just were missing, right? Like when you write papers, you know to write a background, you know to really get into the meat of kind of why are you doing this project and why should people care? And when you go to industry, turns out most of your stakeholders or the people that you're trying to convince about your research, they actually really don't care about that background. They just want to know, what do you find out and what do I need to go do because of it? And so the way that you communicate, the way that you show research to other people is a little bit different. And so I learned a lot of those skills through that internship. And then I had tons of interviews after that internship, after I graduated with my PhD, had all sorts of different companies, from clothing companies who wanted me to look at like, how do men buy pants, to banks that wanted to know, how do people interact with the bank interface when you go into a bank or you use an ATM. So there's tons and tons of applications for research and industry. And I ultimately wound up back at Google because I found a team on Chrome OS that was a really good fit for me and the types of things that I was interested in researching. But like Dr. Weston said, at UTSA, I did a lot of like behavioral health decision making and a little bit on perfection. And my dissertation was actually on condom use and the health decisions that go with that. And my research at Butler was also around health decision making. And so kind of, like I said, the main like line or thread between all of this is just that I love research. I love answering questions. I love trying to solve problems. And that really is what got me from my BA all the way to Google. But I will say that this is like, even this that looks a little bit windy did not come without several existential crises. There were lots of different places where I didn't know what I wanted to do or what could be next for me. Like I said, when I went from my BA to my first PhD program, I was like, I don't know how to apply research. I guess I'll do a clinical program. I don't know what type of clinical work I want to do. I like older adults. Sure, let's do that. And then when dropping out of the first program, it was really stressful to figure out what's next. How can I apply this? What should I do? And then that ending of my first PhD program, when I thought, oh shoot, do I go industry or academics? They both have lots of pros and lots of cons. And trying to make that decision. And then even after my internship, trying to figure out, how do I want to apply this? What do I want to actually do with my life? When I started working at Google on Chrome OS, I'm going to be honest, I didn't know what an operating system was. Like, I understood that Windows existed and I understood that Mac existed. I wouldn't necessarily call myself tech savvy. So I was like, how do I fit in here? What is even an operating system? Like, is this something that is going to allow me to feel like I am fulfilling my passion of research? And it turns out that the answer was definitely yes, because I like solving interesting, unique problems and having that impact, as opposed to feeling like, wow, operating systems are so cool, right? So I want to focus in a little bit on those last steps, because like Dr. Weston said, when I went to the department and said, hey, I think I want to go to industry, they all looked at me like I was crazy. They didn't understand what that meant. They didn't know how to help me, even if they totally understood what my goals were. I even had a professor who would regularly tell me that I needed to do a better job of focusing my research, because I would often get distracted by lots of different research projects that were going on within my department and say, ooh, I'll do your data analysis. Ooh, I'll do your write-up, because it was just answering questions was really interesting. And so I got told, you know, you're probably going to go into academics because that's what the world that they knew. And so I needed to do a better job of focusing my research. But There's lots of resources out there. I'm super glad that we get to participate in this career talk right now, because it can be really confusing and overwhelming to figure out how to make that jump from academics to industry. But there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of things that you can do in order to kind of get yourself out there. So one is figuring out what are the related fields. For research and for psychology, that was things like market research, consumer research, user research. So I really did go through all sorts of different companies. I read hundreds and hundreds of job descriptions on LinkedIn and Indeed and other places, to everywhere from banks to grocery stores, like I said, to men's pants, to technology. There's all sorts of people that benefit from human behavior research. And so I figured out, what are all those types of jobs that I might have a chance at given the skill sets that I have? And what kind of language do they use? How do they talk about the job? What are the things that they're looking for that I have from academics, but because I'm in academics, I think and talk about them differently. And I think that's one of the key things, is figuring out what are your transferable skills, because you as a graduate student have so many transferable skills. You have spent multiple years, if not many, many years, working on your master's, your PhD, or your graduate degree. You know how to communicate, right? You know how to talk about your research to people who are outside of your niche field of study. You know how to ask questions and how to answer those questions. You have critical thinking skills. You know how to do your background research. You understand leadership and project management. And there's a lot of ways that you would frame your graduate degree when you're talking to other people in your field, that if you just change kind of how you think about those transferable skills and how you apply them to industry, you meet a lot of the qualifications that folks in industry are looking for, right? They want somebody who understands how to communicate research to somebody outside of their field who isn't a researcher. And you spent time writing papers, maybe doing poster presentations, maybe just talking to your family about what your research is or what your program is about. And those are all really valuable skills that you can highlight when you're thinking about making that jump. The next one is turning your CV into a resume, which I can tell you is incredibly painful as a graduate student, when you have this lovely CV that's like 5 pages long and you're like, look at all of these presentations I did and all these publications I have. And when you go into industry, they really don't care about that. They care, do you know how to present your research to different audiences? And the answer is yes, which means that those lists of publications and presentations gets cut to one line that says you did X number of presentations and X number of publications. And so figuring out how to communicate your skills, the things that you've done, your experience, into a short, nicely packaged resume is really important when you're making that jump, and being very clear about what your goals are. I can tell you, I just posted a job opening on LinkedIn for a research assistant to work with me, and I got over 150 applications. And so I used to think that it was probably not true when recruiters said, oh, you only get like half a second for someone to glance through your resume. But when I have that many resumes to look through, I look at the resume and I see, okay, does this person state their goals? If I'm hiring a researcher and they say right off the bat they're a designer, they're probably not going to be a good fit, which means I'm not going to spend time digging through the resume to figure out what are your research goals, what's your research experience. I need to know that very clearly right off the bat, right? So being really clear about your goals, taking the language that you would have used to describe your graduate work and putting it in terms of those transferable skills, putting it in terms of the language that the job descriptions use, and just cutting a lot of the content so that it can be really clear and concise to highlight why your graduate skills are an excellent fit for the type of industry job that they're looking for. And the next thing is, as you're going through that job description, you can figure out what are your gaps? Where are there holes in your resume that don't line up with what the job description wants, right? And so for me, as a psych researcher, there were a few different things like methodology. I had done a lot of survey work, I had done a lot of literature reviews, and I had done some experimental work as well when I was an undergraduate. And so I had some methodologies, but I didn't have the full breadth of methodologies that are typically looked for user researchers or any other type of researchers in industry. And so trying to figure out what are those gaps and how can I fill them? How can I go get experience, whether that's an internship, which is what I did, but that's just one way. There's also contract roles that are great ways to get experience. Lots of companies, especially big companies, have contract roles that are 6 months or a year where you can apply, be a research assistant or an entry-level researcher and work temporarily with them in order to gain that experience. There's Coursera, there's lots of boot camps, there's all sorts of resources available, which is what I did in order to get my internship. I said, okay, I know how to do surveys. I can probably fake my way through an interview because I used to be a clinical psychologist. Let me go look up what are the other methods to use and what can I figure out about them, because when I was doing interviews, they didn't necessarily care. As a graduate student, as someone with a PhD, they didn't necessarily care that I had done all of these different methods before. They cared that I had an awareness that there was lots of different methodology that existed in the world and what were the trade-offs and the reasons why you would use one research method over the other. So really just trying to understand what's the position that you're looking for and what's the lay of the land, what methods are they using, what do they want or expect from you in this role, and how can you at least be up to speed enough to leverage that graduate skills, but then really just kind of talk your way through it in a way that says, yes, you understand what's expected of you and you'll get that experience once you're on the job. Other gaps that were in my resume from being a graduate student is that I didn't have a lot of experience connecting findings to recommendations. When I would write academic papers, a lot of the times it would be like, here's all the findings. Next time we do research, we should focus on this next question. And there wasn't a lot of like real world application of what do you do with those findings? Why do they matter? Why are they relevant? How do people act on them, right? Because in academics, we're kind of this feedback loop of research then informs new research, then informs new research. And so in industry, it's research needs to inform product. And so being able to make that connection between findings and recommendations was really important, that I had to spend some time figuring out. When I talk about the findings from my graduate research, how do I talk about that in terms of impact and why that matters and why people should care about this research? So instead of just saying, hey, I did this really cool paper to figure out why perfection leads to poor health choices, I had to say, hey, we care about health choices, and here's a personality trait that informs that. And so here's what we can do with this research to really make it valuable. And so, yeah, internships, contract roles, boot camps, or online courses are all great ways to get some of that additional experience when you're leaving academics. There's also volunteer work. I hire lots of folks who their main UX research experience is through volunteer work. There's like Code Academy, and there's all sorts of different volunteer opportunities where you can go be a researcher, you can go fulfill a role as a volunteer and get that really awesome experience. The next one on the list is reach out to people doing cool stuff. If you find someone doing something cool that you want to do too, reach out to them and talk to them and get their advice. If you want to go into the field of UX, there's a website called UX Coffee, I think it's .com. You can Google UX Coffee, and there's all sorts of people in various UX roles. There's designers and researchers and engineers and writers who are willing to chat with you, to talk to you about what is it like to be in industry. What kinds of things should you be focusing on? How can you clean up your resume? Or if you have a portfolio, how can you make sure that that looks presentable? People love talking about themselves. That is just a fact. I can tell you as a person who spends a lot of time with people, right? This is why I was so excited to come give this talk, because I love, people just like talking about themselves and they're willing to help others. And it can be hard when you're surrounded by academics in your graduate program to think about how do you choose a career path that's not the same one that everyone else around you has chosen. And so you have to actually put in conscious effort to go find those people in industry whose career you want to follow or want to be, and figure out how did they do it? What can you learn from them? How can they help you? This number 5 item is my nice way of saying networking without it sounding so scary, because networking can feel really overwhelming, but that's really what it is meeting people and figuring out, can you ask them for advice? How can they help you? How can you learn from them? That's a really important piece of this that was really, really helpful in me transitioning to internship to a full-time role. And then tons of applications. This is true just because of the job market, and this is just how hiring works, right? As a graduate student, there will definitely be some companies who say, that's great, you have a master's, you have a PhD, but we need someone with a little bit of experience as well, right? Like we've all seen that kind of, not stigma, but that kind of unwillingness to hire a recent graduate because there's this perception that they don't know how to apply their skills. And so in addition to talking about your transferable skills and making it very clear that you understand what skills you've learned as a graduate student, also just quantity is a thing here, right? Doing lots of applications, figuring out anything that's related that you think you might be interested in can be a great starting point, right? I did an internship at Google with accessibility, and I didn't realize that I was super passionate about accessibility yet and building things for folks with disabilities because I just hadn't spent a lot of time in that world. So I said, this seems like it'll be a good fit. I'm interested in the research questions. Let's go do it and get that experience and see if it makes sense for me as a next step too, which it ended up working out well for me. But it's okay to just go get experience in things and see if it's a good fit for you, knowing that you can pivot, right? We live in a world where you can pivot careers all the time. I know lots of people that are user experience researchers that come from engineering. My old coworker was like, had a PhD in furniture architect, like architecture. She like used to build furniture and now she's a user researcher, right? Like people are pivoting all the time. It's no longer the older generation where you start from the bottom and you climb your way up within the same company for 30, 40, 50 years. That's just not the reality of the world we live in anymore. And then finally, practice talking about your work. This is a really, really important thing. Researchers or graduate students can tend to talk at a really high level because you probably are in a graduate program with so many other smart people who know your field. They understand the context when you talk to them. So when I was in my psych PhD program, I could have a casual conversation with someone about logistic regressions and p-values and statistical significance. And when I go try to have those same conversations with my coworkers who are engineers or designers or writers or any other role, they like will just like stare at me blankly. Like they have no idea what I'm talking about. They're very confused. And that's a disconnect, right? That means my research is not being impactful if they don't understand it. And so spending a lot of time talking to your parents, your friends, people outside of your program about how you think and talk about your work can be just a really valuable skill to practice so that when you're interviewing with someone who has the role that you want, but has a different background than you, then they can understand where you're coming from. They can understand why your graduate degree is such a good fit for that role. And they can really understand and follow how you communicate. How do you talk about your work? How do you show why it's important to someone who's not intimately familiar with your field, which can be difficult when you're a grad student and you think everybody knows what you know. And so you don't have that many special skills, right? I felt like that when I was a student. I was like, well, everybody knows how to write a survey, right? All you do is write a survey question and then you go ask people your survey questions and then you get the data back and you see what did they say. And that seems so simple. And then when I came here and I watched other roles, like I watched an engineer once try to write a survey and it hurt my heart to watch because it turns out that's not a skill that everyone has. And so really recognizing the value of your graduate degree will just take you a long way in understanding what are unique skills that you have that you bring to a position that other people don't have. All right, so that's a little bit about me and my journey. Thank you so much for listening. It's always fun talking about the kind of windy path that I took and the different ways that I've seen other researchers get to where I'm at. So I'd love to answer some questions if you have any.